It's amazing when you've got an anonymous forum like I have, the amount of people that are willing to come forward and to share the most unbelievable stories that they've literally been sitting on for years, not telling a soul. I believe that there are tons of those stories out there because many of them are flying through my doors. And this is one of those stories today, and I know you're going to love it. I want to call this story In a Hunt for the Yellow Diamond. You'll see what I mean when we get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, it was in 1957 and I was 25 years old at the time, and I was not married, unlike all my fortunate friends who not only had wonderful husbands but also beautiful babies on the way too. In those days, being 25 and not married was really very much like being on the shelf or an old maid. Thankfully, it's not like that today, but that's how it was in my generation. I was living with my parents at the time in a large bungalow, and even they were piling on the pressure, making things exceedingly awkward for me. They were begging me to get married. When is Roland going to do the decent thing and pop the question, my mother would constantly ask. You're not getting any younger, and I'm longing for some grandbabies. I had been dating Roland for 8 long years, and he still had not asked me to marry him. I could not understand what was keeping him from making an honest woman out of me. After all, we'd been dating for a long time, and we were incredibly close and very much in love. One day when I was sitting on my friend's lawn having drinks with some of my girlfriends, they all quizzed me about Roland's strange behaviour. You need to give him an ultimatum, said one of my friends. Otherwise, that dude is never going to pop the question. Everyone wholeheartedly agreed. If he doesn't want to marry you, well and good, said another friend. At least you know where you stand. You don't want to be 30 and left on the shelf. What they were saying made absolute sense to me. Even though it was not the done thing in those days for a woman to take the initiative in a marriage proposal, if I didn't give Roland a little push, we might never get married, and that thought was inconceivable to me. It was on a Sunday afternoon when Roland and I were taking a drive in his car around the countryside when I broached the very sensitive subject of marriage. Roland, I said, I'm 25 and I'm not getting any younger. Yeah? So, he said, with a dopey expression on his face. You're telling me something I already know. Well, I want to get married and have kids, I said. Roland's mouth did a nosedive, and he looked at me with a horrified expression on his face, as if I'd just told him that he was sentenced to life imprisonment. You want to get married, he said. I nodded. We've been dating for over 8 years, I said. It's the logical next step, isn't it? Isn't that something that we should do? We've been together for so long now. Roland's mouth was so wide, it looked like he would swallow an entire goldfish. That was how shocked he appeared. For a long while, the car was so silent, you could have heard a pin drop. Then he said absolutely nothing. He pressed down the accelerator with his foot and took me home as quickly as he could, without saying a single word. Even when I got out of the car and slammed the door behind me, no word was said, and he never even said goodbye. Tears rolled down my cheeks, and I realised our relationship was well and truly over, and that I was never going to hear from Roland again. The idea of marriage had completely freaked him out. Well, at least I knew where I stood, I thought regretfully. Imagine my surprise when about 3 days later, Roland called me and asked me out on a date. I could hardly believe it, because I had truly resigned myself to the fact that we were well and truly finished. Roland told me to close my eyes as he led me into the beautiful clearing in the woods where he had prepared the most magnificent picnic for both of us. There was champagne on ice, strawberries dipped in chocolate, salmon sandwiches, and turkey and cheese rolls, as well as chocolate cake. It was a sumptuous spread, and I couldn't believe he'd gone to so much trouble on my account. I truly felt privileged and very lucky. Suddenly Roland got on his knees and presented me with a little box. Was this really happening? Was he about to propose to me? It just seemed too good to be true. He opened the box and I saw the most enormous, glistening, bright yellow diamond, surrounded with clusters of pretty white diamond, staring back at me. I'd never seen such a beautiful ring in all my life. And he slipped it on my finger, and yes, he popped the question. "Will you marry me, Sue?" he asked. "Yes, yes, yes!" I cried in joy, jumping up and down like an excitable puppy dog. The ring was very loose on my finger, but I didn't care. I knew I needed it to be adjusted, but I didn't say anything to Roland because I was so delighted and I didn't want to take it off. "How could you afford a ring like this?" I asked. "It must have cost you an absolute fortune." "Never you mind about that," said Roland. "Only the best is good enough for you." I could not wipe the smile off my face, and I raced to my best friend's house to tell her the good news. "Oh, I'm so happy for you." "It's about time too. Let's see the ring. Let's see the ring. Go on." Beth let out a huge gasp as she studied the splendid ring on my finger. "Oh my goodness," she said. "It is utterly breathtaking. I don't believe I've ever seen a more beautiful ring in my entire life. Did Roland rob the bank?" Beth called her mother over to view my ring. "Mum, you've got to see Sue's ring. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this in my life." Beth's mum had a background in jewellery, so she knew all about diamonds and precious stones. So she studied my ring with a look of shock growing on her face. "Where did Roland get this ring from?" she asked. "I've no idea," I said, "but I'm so thrilled with it. I love the huge yellow centre and the diamonds surrounding the edge. It's so unusual." "It is unusual. It's a yellow diamond," said my friend's mother, "and it's worth a great deal of money. You're a very lucky girl." I looked at Beth and her mother in shock, and without knowing what to say, I excused myself quickly and hurried back home, really regretting the visit. You see, Roland lived in a very basic cabin on his parents' land, and all his life, both he and his parents had struggled financially. How on earth had he managed to present me with such an expensive stone? It just did not make sense, and that worried me. Feeling frustrated and bewildered by what had just happened at Beth's house and realizing how valuable my ring was, I now had more questions than answers in my mind, and my gut was not feeling good about this engagement ring. Something felt distinctly off. I decided to go for a run in the woods. That was my way of unwinding, letting go, clearing my mind, and letting off a little steam. I put on my running shoes and proceeded to go for a run, all the while wondering what I was going to do and how I was going to broach Roland about the ring without sounding suspicious. I kept telling myself that maybe it had belonged to his mother once, yet why would they sit on a ring as valuable as this if they couldn't even afford to repair their leaky roof? That just didn't make sense to me. That evening I got another call from Beth. "I think there's something odd about your ring," she said. "My mother said it's worth a fortune. There's no way Roland has that kind of money. Something's going on." "Are you sure it's worth a lot?" I asked. "Very sure. Also, my mother says the stone is rare." I looked down at my finger to re-examine the stone, and I realized with horror that it was no longer on my finger. "Oh, no, 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 no," I cried. "What's the matter?" asked Beth. "I've lost the ring. It was loose on my finger and it must have fallen off my hand, and I think I dropped it when I went running in the woods." Beth was horrified. "Are you crazy? Wearing a ring as valuable as that on a run while it's loose on your finger? You'll never find it." I slammed down the phone in a panic. What was I to do? It was getting dark outside and my precious ring was lying somewhere in that woods, and I needed to retrieve it. The idea of waiting until the morning to find it was inconceivable, and besides, I would only be lying awake all night worrying about it. I grabbed my father's brand new 1960s metal detector and bounded towards the woods with only one thing on my mind, and that was to retrieve the ring. As I approached the woods, it was eerily quiet, and yet during the day it had been full of pretty bird song. There were no animal sounds, no owls, no crickets, and no calls of coyotes. I heard none of those noises that we would normally hear on a nightly basis. It really gave me an ominous, disturbing feeling that I just did not like. Needless to say, nothing was going to deter me from my mission. The ring needed to be found, and its questionable value made it that much more significant. I started using the metal detector around the whole area where I usually go running, and I was retrieving all kinds of stuff like old screws and coins. I realised that this job was going to be daunting and could take all night, because the beeper continued to go off, because someone had clumsily sprinkled piles of rusty nails all over the forest floor, and at this rate I would never find the ring. Suddenly I heard the most terrifying noise, and truly it sounded more supernatural than natural, almost like galloping horses' hooves racing through the forest at 1,000 miles an hour. But they were heavier than that, and whatever it was, I could tell it was coming in my direction, and very fast. I quickly got out of the way and hid behind a massive tree that had all the moss growing up its girth. The thundering sound came to a sudden stop only yards away from me, and I could hear a distinct grunting sound that sounded exactly like an ape. I was almost too terrified to peek at the creature to see what it was. I could sense that it had a formidable presence of an apex predator. I did not have to see the creature to know that, because I could sense how powerful and strong it was, and even if my eyes were closed, I could feel that powerful presence. I peered through a hollowed opening in the cavity of the trunk of the tree, and luckily shafts of moonlight twinkled through the trees and lit up the creature's body. I got a really good side view of the creature, and he was enormous. He was bipedal and humanoid in his appearance, although he was definitely not human. He had dark hair covering his entire body, but I detected the side of his long greyish face had absolutely no hair. He had a very strong brow ridge, very flat dark-skinned nose, very wide deep-set eyes, and thin lips. I was amazed how much detail I could see under the moonlight, and that was when I realised it had to be a full moon, and the canopy above my head must have had an enormous opening to allow this much light to stream through. I was awestruck by this creature and terrified by him at the same time. If he saw me, I was certain that I would be table scraps for him. This creature was utterly enormous, and at a guess he was at least 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, and possibly even more. I have never been good on measurements, but this humanoid thing, whatever it was massive. The creature just stood there and sniffed the air, and I realised with horror that he could have detected my human smell. However, the breeze that night was fortunately blowing in the opposite direction, and that might have been to my advantage. He continued to sniff, and then his attention was diverted to something that was wiggling frantically in the brush. It was a deer that had got snagged up in a thorn bush and was frantically trying to escape, because it had sensed the impending danger, and it got more and more ensnared the more it tried to wriggle. His struggle and distress sounds truly succeeded in only drawing attention to itself. This was an easy meal for this predator, and he wasted no time in lunging towards it, and it had no hope of escaping. And I heard a loud snap, the sound of a limb being disabled, which I imagine was to immobilize the creature so that it couldn't run away. Then I heard a loud rustling sound and a dragging sound as the deer was pulled through the brush, and then there was this thunderous thud. I think the hairy humanoid threw the deer's body against the tree trunk, I was hiding behind with such a force that the deer must have been instantly killed. I felt a huge empathy for the poor little creature to have been killed in such a violent way. For a moment all was still and everything seemed very silent, and then I heard the creature whistling to himself in the way that a human would. Suddenly I could hear slapping sounds around the woods coming from further away, and then the creature responded by slapping the very tree trunk that I was hiding behind. Believe me, he slapped it so hard that I almost jumped out of my skin. I was so terrified. Then I heard these strange calls, almost like whooping sounds that seemed to be coming from different areas of the woods, that sounded like some form of interactive communication. And it was with horror I realized that there were others around, just like him. And the thought of this sent waves of terror flooding through my entire body, and I was shaking like a leaf. By this time I was so terrified and so anxious of being discovered by the creature. I was so surprised that he had not detected me, because I was sure that I must have some kind of human odour, because this creature had a smell all of its own that was so pungent and dreadful that it reminded me of raw sewage, so surely I had some kind of a smell too. I continued to hang on to the hope that the wind was indeed blowing my scent in the opposite direction. Then I remembered that the woods were visited regularly by human hikers on a daily basis, and who knows, maybe the woods were filled with traces of their lingering smells. That's the only hope that I could explain why this creature did not see me, because he may have felt that my smell was from a hiker early in the day, that is, of course, if he did get a whiff of me. I peered at the creature and saw him scratching himself with a very long stick, very much like those bath brushes we have for scrubbing our backs. He used the stick to rub up against his back in the places that he couldn't reach, and he found an area that obviously was particularly itchy, and he scratched that area for some time. And as he did this, I could hear him making low moans of pleasure, as if he was finally satisfying a very frustrating itch that he'd possibly had all day. I then suddenly heard this thunderous galloping sound coming towards the clearing, and by this time I was freaking out, because I knew what that sound was. Whatever it was did not come into view, but started to chatter towards the creature, which went on for a few seconds, and both creatures appeared to be engaged in this weird kind of conversation that sounded as if they were speaking gibberish, but they did clearly understand each other. It was almost like the other creature, well, that's the impression I got, had come to get him to go back to where they were probably nesting. The creature threw the deer over his shoulder and trampled through the dense thorny thicket, and that wasn't any barrier to him whatsoever, and he thundered away. I could hear two of these creatures tearing through the forest like a couple of massive bulldozers, and when they moved, the trees swayed under their great girths, and these were big trees we're talking about. After they had gone, all was very silent, and then suddenly the chorus of crickets started to sing again, and I could hear the sounds of the owls and the coyotes. It was almost as if the conductor was saying, "Come on, now we can get singing again." In my terror, I just fled away from the forest as fast as I could, and I left my dad's metal detector behind on the forest floor, and even the precious diamond ring was lying there somewhere, and I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get as far away from this forest as I could. It was weird because I seemed to have a delayed panic response that evening, after I had seen that creature. And when I got home, I broke out into an anxious sweat all over my body, and I started hyperventilating. My mother, seeing me in this dreadful state and not knowing what was wrong with me, immediately called the emergency services, and I was rushed to hospital immediately that night. Everyone thought I was having a cardiac arrest, and so did I. I even remember thinking that the creature may not have killed me in the forest, but he was killing me now due to the post-traumatic shock I was suffering. I was later to discover that I just suffered from a panic attack. It took me a while to calm down, but I returned home several hours later with a clean bill of health, only to be even more anxious when Beth phoned me the following morning. "I don't know how to say this to you," she said, "but the ring Roland gave you, I think it was stolen." "What makes you say that?" I asked. "Well, there was an armed robbery at the jeweller's, and a whole lot of jewellery was stolen, and some of it was very valuable, especially a yellow diamond engagement ring that was worth a fortune." I knew in my gut that Roland had stolen that ring, but to hear my friend confirm my worst fears was utterly terrifying. If this got out, Roland could be looking at a prison sentence. Why had he done something as reckless and as foolish as this, that could jeopardize our whole future together? Was he completely insane, I wondered? I thanked Beth for the information and raced to Roland's parents' house as fast as I possibly could, and I whizzed down the bumpy dirt track, parking my little car outside Roland's cabin. I knew without a shadow of doubt that Roland had robbed the jewellers, and I had to make it right and fix this problem before things got seriously out of hand. The cabin door was wide open, and there was no one around, not even Roland, but the place was an absolute pigsty, with clothing haphazardly gracing every available surface area. There was empty Chinese takeaway cartons and pizza boxes, as well as crushed beer cans absolutely everywhere. I started searching every corner of his cabin, trying to find the rest of the missing jewellery that he had taken. I was shocked to find that all the jewellery had been placed in a large coffee tin and was sitting close to the bright red kettle on the sideboard. Roland's toy gun was laying strewn over the sofa, but it was in such a good imitation that I realised that it could have easily been mistaken for the real thing, and I imagined it was what he had used during the jewellery robbery. I also discovered the remnants of the most ghastly facial hair accessories that I have ever seen in my life. They were thick and hairy, and there was a fake beard and a bushy eyebrows and moustache lying across the bathroom sink, and I realised that this was the disguise that Roland had used to change his appearance, and he must have looked horrendously hairy in his disguise. I flung all the jewellery into my handbag and raced home, and then proceeded to pile on lots of red lipstick and put on an auburn wig as well as a dress that belonged to my mother, so as to appear older than my natural age. I then placed the jewellery in a box, wrapped it up in a brown paper box with a red ribbon tied around its middle. A little bell jangled as I entered the shop. "Hello, ma'am, can I help you?" said a jovial man, wearing glasses and a big smile. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" "I'm looking for the manager," I said. "I am he," said the man. "How can I be of service, man?" "This is for you," I said. The man opened the box and pulled out the jewellery in his long, pale hands, and then his eyes grew wide with surprise. "This is the jewellery that was stolen from my store 3 days ago during an armed robbery. Everything is here minus a very precious yellow diamond ring. Where on earth did you find this?" "Let's just say it came into my possession," I said, and with that I walked out of the store, with the jeweller asking me to hold on, because I've got more questions for you. I ran to the car as fast as I could. Then I dived into the seat, turned on the engine, and pressed down the accelerator, and raced home at an unspeakable speed. The following day I heard my mother and father talking together. They were discussing the papers, and my father read out some of the articles for us to listen to, while my mother fried breakfast of eggs and bacon on the gas hob. This was something we always did as a family, so my father would always read the articles so that we knew what was going on in the world without having to tune into the radio. My father read, "Jewellery theft mystery. A mystery woman with auburn hair ventured into the jeweller's yesterday, presenting the store manager with all the missing jewellery that was stolen on Tuesday, with the exception of a yellow diamond ring of extreme value that remains missing." The manager described the mystery woman as a young, glamorous and attractive woman. She was well-spoken and polite, but I sensed she knew more about the robbery than she was letting on. When I tried to question her, she ran away. The jewellery store in question suffered a dangerous armed robbery at about 10:33 on Tuesday morning. The armed bandit was described as particularly hairy, with very bushy eyebrows, moustache and long unkept beard. It was difficult to see his face because of his excessive facial hair, but he did have a slender body and was about 6 foot tall. If anyone knows who the mystery auburn-haired woman is, who the hairy bandit is, or where the yellow diamond is, call us on 556-5567. Fancy that, said my mother in surprise. Who commits a robbery and then returns all the loot? It is very odd, said my father. Very odd indeed. The next day there was another newspaper report that read, Mrs. Rebecca Greenwood was walking her dog in the vicinity of the woods yesterday when she distinctly heard a very loud whistle, and she sensed that someone very hostile was spying on her. It was a horrible feeling, she said. I knew there was a man staring at me because I felt his eyes on me, and they were menacing and creepy. Suddenly I saw this yellow stone shining brilliantly on the forest floor. I knew it was the missing diamond that was stolen from the jewellery robbery. I picked it up off the ground and I heard the man rustling behind the tree, and he was trying to deliberately scare me by moving with heavy movements, almost like he was pretending to be a bear or something big. But I was not buying his act. I think he was angry that I had found the ring, because he thrashed the tree very hard and growled at me and sounded just like a lion. His imitation of the creature was very impressive, but I refused to be terrorized by such a bully. He was probably thinking I would drop the ring and run away in terror, but I am not easily conned. I believe this armed, unshaved, hairy bandit is living in the woods, and he was possibly looking for the lost diamond that he dropped, because I saw his metal detector that he was using on the ground very close to where the ring was. I surmised he was probably searching for the thing before I showed up with my dog, and then he hid from me in case I was to identify who he actually was. I will not be going to the woods anytime soon because the armed bandit is clearly there. He even upset my dog, who usually conducts herself very well, but since she has returned home, her lavatory habits have changed dramatically and she is wetting herself regularly. I have had to use nappies on her to prevent further accidents. I do believe this horrible man is to blame for my poor little Nettle's anxiety. As you can imagine, I hooted with laughter when I read the article, because I think Mrs. Greenwood possibly did encounter the creature I had seen the night before. I am glad to tell you that things settled down in the town, and the robbery story was soon forgotten, as other scandals invariably surfaced, as they always do in small towns like ours. I did confront Roland about the jewellery theft, because it was so out of character for him to have done something like this. I am glad to say that the deadly weapon was a toy gun, so no one would ever have been hurt. Even so, it does not excuse what Roland did, and the reason he did not ask me to marry him for 8 long years was because he wanted to buy me a fancy, beautiful ring and could not afford it. Instead, he took the jeweller's most expensive, rare diamond. I still cannot believe what he did, but I know his motive was born out of love and giving me the perfect engagement ring. Roland and I have now been married forever, and I love him so much, but he could have been locked away if he had been caught, all because of this stupid engagement ring. The thought of him having been locked away for this does not bear thinking about, but people do the craziest things for love. As for the creature in the forest, I was to find out years later that what I saw was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or a hairy man. You choose what you want to call him. One thing I know is that he's real, because I saw him myself when I was hunting for the yellow diamond. I love that story. I really do. And it is true, people will do the craziest things for love. But what an encounter, losing your ring in the forest, going and searching for it at night. I think I would have done the same, because it's such a beautiful ring and you're so terrified that you just, when you've lost something like that, you've got to find it. And even if it's dark out there, you're just going to go out and look for it. And lo and behold, you had the most incredible encounter. But I did feel very sorry for the deer that was caught up in that tree. And the trouble is, when you get caught up in a thorn bush or something, it's very difficult to get out of it. And it was a sitting duck for that Bigfoot, I'm afraid. Until next time, goodbye and good night.